Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a story that feels almost like a dream, but it's one I lived with my own hands, step by step. I want you to imagine the soft rustle of sheets in a grand hotel room, the muffled clinking of glasses in the dining hall, and somewhere down the hall, me bent over a broom sweeping crumbs and dust no one else cared to notice. It's not glamorous, not the kind of job anyone writes home about, but it was my world. And trust me, if you were in my shoes back then, you probably wouldn't have survived the smell of stale carpet cleaner mixed with too strong perfume. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're rewatching from and what time it is. I always love picturing you there, somewhere far away, but sharing this same quiet moment with me. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. I still remember the first day I walked into that hotel with a pressed uniform that wasn't even mine. It was borrowed, too long in the sleeves, and smelled faintly of mothballs, but I tucked it in anyway and tried to stand tall. The marble floor in the lobby stretched out like an ocean, glossy and intimidating, and I felt like a tiny shipwreck of a person drifting across it. My hands clutched the cleaning cart, as if it were a life raft. Guests walked past without seeing me at least, not as a person. To them, I was just another shadow in beige polyester, pushing a rattling cart stocked with harsh chemicals and half-empty soap bottles. It's funny, historians still argue about when society decided uniforms should make people blend in instead of stand out. All I know is, mine turned me invisible. The job was simple enough: sweep, dust, change sheets, empty bins. But the real challenge was the silence. Silence is heavy in those long hallways, interrupted only by the soft thud of footsteps or the sudden slam of a door. My ears picked up details I'd never noticed before: the hum of vending machines, the squeak of wheels on tile, the echo of laughter that wasn't mine. That laughter, it stung the most. I learned quickly that my job wasn't just cleaning rooms. It was carrying the weight of other people's messes, their carelessness, and sometimes even their cruelty. I once found a sandwich shoved under a mattress, mold blooming across it like some science experiment gone wrong. Another time, I discovered a guest had scribbled "loser" on the notepad and left it behind, as if the word were meant for whoever picked it up. Me. Still, there were moments of strange beauty. Polishing mirrors at midnight meant I got to see my reflection in 100 different angles, a fragmented version of myself. Sometimes I caught my own eyes and whispered promises into the glass. One day, I won't be standing here. I knew it sounded ridiculous, like a kid telling their reflection they'll become a superhero. But maybe, in that quiet, I believed it. And then there was the smell of fresh sheets. That was my secret escape. Sliding my face into a pile of clean pillowcases was like pressing against clouds. I'd inhaled deeply, and for a second, the world didn't feel so cruel. That little sensory gift was my version of luxury. But let me tell you a small joke I used to whisper to myself. If I ever disappear, just follow the trail of lemon-scented cleaner aisle. Be at the end of it. It was silly. But when your days blend together like identical rooms, humor becomes survival. That first week, my body ached in ways I didn't know it could. My knees throbbed from kneeling to scrub bathroom tiles, and my fingers cracked from bleach, turning my knuckles into a map of tiny wounds. At night, I collapsed onto my own bedwan with no crisp sheets, just a thin blanket and the lingering smell of detergent, and wondered if this was all my life would ever be. But here's the thing, the walls of that hotel whispered to me. Not literally, of course, don't worry. This isn't a ghost story, but the way conversations carried through vents, the way guests treated staff, the way money moved like an invisible current. I started paying attention. And that, unknowingly, was the beginning of something much bigger. Because while my hands scrubbed and polished, my mind was taking notes, and each note would someday stitch into a plan I never dared speak out loud. Those stares, you know, the ones, the kind that slide over your skin like cold water, leaving you shivering long after the person has walked away. I felt them every day in that hotel. Guests glanced at me as if I were part of the furniture, something functional, something that had to be there, but not worth a second thought. Sometimes it was worse. They looked at me like I had failed at life, as if scrubbing their bathtub proved I was destined for nothing more. I tried to ignore it, but those glances had weight. They pressed down on my shoulders, heavier than the laundry bags I hauled up the stairs. One woman in a glittering red dress actually waved me away once, like I was a fly buzzing too close to her champagne glass. I smiled politely, but inside I thought, lady, if only you knew that the fly could be the one scrubbing your lipstick out of a pillow later tonight. Here's the funny part. Historians still argue about when luxury hotels became symbols of social hierarchy. But from where I stood, it didn't take a historian to see the divide. Guests floated through marble halls with heels clicking like applause, while staff crept quietly behind, patching cracks, carrying trays, cleaning the invisible mess of privilege. Sometimes, the humiliation came in small, almost comical packages, like the time a businessman threw his tie at me and said, "Steam this, would you?" I wasn't even part of laundry services, but I took it anyway. Later, I laughed to myself imagining him giving a big speech with a tie that smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant, because I'd used the wrong steamer. A petty victory, but hey, those were the only victories I had. The cruelest part, though, wasn't the guests, it was the other staff. Some of them, veterans of the hotel game, sneered at newcomers like me. They rolled their eyes when I made mistakes like stacking towels the wrong way, which apparently was a crime against humanity. One supervisor once told me, "You'll never last here, you're too soft." I smiled, nodded, and tucked the words into my pocket like a stone. Heavy at first, but eventually, I'd learn how to throw it back. There were nights when I stood in the staff break room, staring at the vending machine, debating whether I should spend my last few coins on a chocolate bar or save them. Spoiler, the chocolate usually won. And honestly, that chocolate, eaten in silence under flickering fluorescent lights, felt like rebellion. Like, take that, world. I may be broke, but I've got caramel stuck in my teeth. I remember once, polishing the brass handles of the lobby doors, when a little boy pointed at me and whispered to his father, "Is he poor?" The father hushed him quickly, but I heard it. Children have a way of asking the questions adults try to bury. I pretended not to notice, but inside, I burned with both shame and determination. At night, lying in my tiny rented room, I replayed all those looks and words. They could have crushed me, but instead, they carved me into something sharper. Every insult, every laugh, every dismissive wave, it all became fuel. And here's where the twist begins. In those moments of belittlement, I started noticing patterns. How the wealthy ordered room service not because they were hungry, but because they wanted to be served. How they demanded spotless perfection even in spaces they'd trash in an hour. The psychology of power laid bare in dirty sheets and half-drunk glasses of wine. I started to think, maybe this wasn't the end of the road. Maybe it was training. Unofficial, exhausting, humiliating training, but training nonetheless. Because while they saw a servant, I was secretly taking notes on the mechanics of luxury, the art of hospitality, the currency of status, and to keep myself sane, I cracked jokes in my head. If arrogance could be bottled, this place could stop importing champagne. Or who needs cable TV when the guest arguments echo through the vents louder than a soap opera? I didn't say them out loud. Of course I valued my job too much, but inside, humor kept me afloat. I didn't realize it yet, but every glance of disdain was shaping me. Like sandpaper on wood, their contempt smoothed away whatever fragility I had left, and deep down, I began whispering to myself, one day you'll stand in the same lobby, but no one will dare wave you away. By then, I had learned how to make my uniform feel like armor. Not shiny armor, of course, more like the dented, scratchy kind you'd pick up at a thrift store. But it did the job. I tucked away my pride in the breast pocket, right next to the tiny notebook I carried everywhere. That notebook was my real secret. Inside, I scribbled thoughts, numbers, and observations that had nothing to do with dusting or vacuuming. You see, while most people thought I was just pushing a cart, I was quietly building blueprints in my head. Every payday, I folded my cash into that same notebook, slipping it into the lining, as if I were hiding treasure from pirates. Sometimes it was just a few coins. sometimes a crumpled bill or two, but I saved them all. It wasn't much, but it was something, a spark of hope in an otherwise fluorescent-lit existence. I used to joke to myself, if ambition could be cleaned up with bleach, I'd be a millionaire by now. The truth is, I was scrubbing away other people's dirt, while secretly scrubbing together a future for myself. The guests, of course, never noticed. They dropped money like leaves in autumn, careless, endless, floating everywhere. Once, I picked up a receipt they left behind from the hotel restaurant. A single dinner cost more than my entire week's wage. I stood there staring at the number, my mop in hand, and whispered, "You've got to be kidding me." That moment stung, but it also sharpened something inside me. It was proof that money wasn't some mystical force. It was simply being spent differently by people who had more of it. Historians still argue about whether social mobility is real or just a myth society sells to keep workers dreaming. I can't answer that for everyone, but I can tell you this. In that hotel, I decided mobility would be real for me, no matter how long it took. Every time I folded a towel, I pictured folding away another layer of doubt. Every time I dusted a chandelier, I imagined myself climbing higher. It sounds dramatic, but when your reality is scrubbing toothpaste out of a sink at midnight, you've got to invent metaphors just to survive. My notebook became more than just a ledger of savings. I wrote down overheard conversations, snippets of how business deals were made, the way rich guests complained about taxes, the hotels they compared this one to. To them their words were casual, to me they were clues, like breadcrumbs in a forest. One evening a guest in a tailored suit left behind a magazine in the lobby. I picked it up while pretending to polish the side table. Inside was an article about property investment. I didn't understand half the terms, equity, ROI, leverage, but I wrote them down anyway. Later, on my phone, I searched what they meant, piece by piece, like solving a puzzle. There was a strange comfort in this double life. By day, invisible worker. By night, secret student. I studied hospitality not from textbooks, but from the mistakes and demands of entitled guests. I studied money not in classrooms, but from crumpled receipts and overheard phone calls. The truth is, I wasn't just dreaming, I was training, silently, stubbornly. With every coin stuffed into my notebook, I was inching toward something no one around me could see. And yes, I had my little comic reliefs, like the time I imagined the hotel's slogan could be, "We treat you like royalty, and our staff like invisible ghosts." Or when I laughed to myself that my mop and I were in a committed relationship after all. It was the only one that never left me. Still, those private jokes kept me sane while I built a world in secret. My savings, tiny as they were, felt like a rebellion against the way people saw me. The more they dismissed me, the more I tucked away, until my notebook bulged like it had its own heartbeat. And though I was still nothing more than the help in their eyes, inside I was carrying a plan like a secret ember in my pocket, waiting for its chance to burst into flame. The hallways at night were my classrooms. You'd think a hotel would sleep when the guests did, but no, the place breathed differently after dark. The chandeliers hummed faintly, the air vents whispered, and the polished floors reflected slivers of moonlight that spilled through high windows. I moved quietly with my cart, broom squeaking, mop sloshing, but my ears were always tuned in to the soundtrack of wealth. Once I paused near a door left ajar and heard a group of businessmen laughing about a deal that only took a handshake and a bottle of whiskey. To them, it was a joke. To me, it was a revelation. Deals weren't just numbers on paper, they were built on trust, timing, and the art of making someone feel important. I wrote it down later in my notebook. People don't buy services, they buy feelings. That little phrase would become one of my golden rules. And then there were the odd lessons I didn't expect, like watching how guests reacted to the smallest details, whether a mint was left on the pillow, whether the water in the ice bucket was cold enough. You'd think no one cared, but oh, they noticed. I began to see the invisible gears of hospitality, the thousand tiny gestures that created the illusion of luxury. Historians still argue about where the concept of hospitality really began, whether it was ancient Greece with their sacred duty to host travelers, or medieval inns offering straw beds to pilgrims. All I knew was that in modern hotels, Hospitality was both a business and a performance. A smile could be as valuable as clean sheets. There was one night I'll never forget. I was dusting picture frames in the corridor when I overheard two wealthy guests complaining about another hotel they stayed at. Terrible staff, no attention to detail, one said. If I were running the place, I'd fire half of them. His friend laughed and replied, "That's why we stay here, the service is flawless." They didn't know the flawless service was being provided by people like me, dragging themselves through 14-hour shifts for wages that could barely cover rent. I smiled bitterly, but also tucked the lesson away. Perception was everything. My hands ached as I worked, but my mind was alive, piecing together patterns. The hotel was like a textbook no one else realized existed. Even the mistakes became lessons. Like the time a coworker spilled coffee all over a guest's luggage, chaos, shouting, "Refunds." I didn't just see the disaster, I saw how management handled it, how they calmed the guest, how they framed compensation as generosity rather than obligation. In my notebook I wrote, "Mistakes are free chances to prove value." Of course, humor was my survival kit. I remember whispering to myself, if knowledge is power, I'm basically getting an MBA in mop science. Or when I'd pass through the banquet hall and see leftover fancy cakes, I'd laugh. Who knew my tuition fees came in the form of half-eaten tiramisu? The corridors held secrets too, like the night I found an old key lying forgotten near the stairwell. It didn't match any of the modern rooms, so curiosity tugged at me. I slipped it into my pocket and later discovered it unlocked a storage room full of outdated hotel records. Dusty ledgers, old menus, stacks of invoices. To most people, it was junk. To me, it was gold. I spent nights flipping through those papers, tracing the hotel's history, learning how expenses were managed, how prices had changed, what strategies had failed. It was like discovering the DNA of the business. That hidden room became my sanctuary. I'd sneak in during late shifts, flashlight in hand, notebook open. The dust smelled like old paperbacks, and the silence was so deep it almost felt sacred. There, I wasn't just a cleaner. I was an archaeologist digging up the bones of hospitality. And every night, as I locked the door behind me, I whispered a private promise. Someday I won't just work in a hotel. I'll own one. If you've ever had a mentor appear in your life out of nowhere, you'll know the strange mix of gratitude and disbelief that follows. Mine came in the form of an older housekeeper named Rosa. She had been in the hotel industry longer than I had been alive, and she carried herself with the weary grace of someone who had seen every kind of mess imaginable both in rooms and in people. Rosa had a voice like gravel softened by honey. One night while we were folding sheets in the laundry room, she leaned toward me and said, "You don't really belong here, do you?" I blinked, unsure what she meant. She chuckled, "Don't look so shocked. I can tell. You're not just cleaning rooms, you're studying them." It was true, of course. She had caught me scribbling in my notebook during breaks, jotting down observations instead of resting my aching feet. Instead of mocking me, she started sharing her own lessons. She told me about the revolving doors of management, about the guests who never tipped no matter how wealthy they were, about the patterns of who succeeded and who burned out. Historians still argue about whether success is more about talent or connections. Rosa had neither, just survival. But she passed on a piece of wisdom I never forgot. The secret isn't knowing how to serve, it's knowing what people think they deserve. That one line lit up my brain like a chandelier. From then on, Rosa became my unofficial tutor. She explained how to read guests by their shoes. Expensive leather meant high expectations. Worn sneakers meant they just wanted peace. She showed me the unspoken rules, like always knocking twice, even if you're sure a room is empty, because dignity matters more than efficiency. And in between lessons, she made me laugh. Like when she said, if these carpets could talk, they'd probably sue for emotional damage. Or when she rolled her eyes and declared, this uniform isn't polyester, it's 100% humiliation fabric. Humor was her armor too, and I admired her for it. One evening we sat in the staff cafeteria, eating reheated leftovers. She leaned back and told me about a time she had saved up to open a tiny bed and breakfast in her hometown, only for it to collapse after a single bad season. I expected bitterness, but she smiled softly. Failure teaches you twice. Once in losing, and once in learning. That night, I copied the line word for word into my notebook. It was Rosa who taught me how to look beyond the mop handle. She encouraged me to keep saving, to keep studying those ledgers I found in the storage room. She even smuggled me old management manuals that had been tossed out, saying, "If the bosses don't want these anymore, maybe you will." Of course, not everyone liked our little alliance. Some co-workers muttered that I was brown-nosing or wasting time. I ignored them. Rosa was the only person who saw me as more than a uniform, and that was enough. But perhaps the most valuable gift she gave me was her stories. She told me about guests who tipped with jewelry instead of cash, about the scandal of a senator caught sneaking out through the kitchen, about the endless parade of human drama that unfolded behind polished walls. Each tale was both entertaining and instructive. They reminded me that hotels weren't just buildings, they were theaters, with guests as actors and staff as the stagehands making sure the show never collapsed. I remember joking once, "So basically, we're running a circus without the applause." Rosa smirked. "Exactly. But one day, maybe you'll be the ringmaster instead of the janitor." Her faith in me was like oxygen. For the first time I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't foolish to dream beyond the broom. And when she pressed a worn keychain into my hand one night, just a simple trinket from her failed bed and breakfast, I held it like a talisman. "For luck," she said. I didn't know it then, but her lessons would become the backbone of my journey. Every laugh, every whispered secret, every late-night lecture in the laundry room was shaping me, preparing me for storms I didn't even know were coming. It was the kind of day that starts ordinary and ends with you wondering if the universe just decided to prank you. I came in early, uniform pressed, ready for another round of invisible labor, but before noon, my world flipped. The trouble began with a guest on the 9th floor. A wealthy couple had checked in, the kind who traveled with matching luggage sets and perfume strong enough to suffocate a horse. Their room assignment had been botched by the front desk, and somehow, the blame landed on me. Why? Because I was the one standing closest when the shouting started. The husband barked, "This is unacceptable," while the wife tapped her nails against the marble counter like she was composing a death march. I stood there holding my cleaning supplies, wishing I could melt into the floor. The manager appeared, eyes darting, desperate for someone to sacrifice. And wouldn't you know it was me. "You should have checked the assignment list properly," he snapped, loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. My cheeks burned. I wanted to protest I didn't even have access to the assignment list, but I bit my tongue. In the service world, arguing with management is like bringing a water pistol to a forest fire. Historians still argue about whether scapegoating is a natural human instinct, or just a bad leadership habit. Either way, I was the scapegoat that day. They suspended me on the spot. No paycheck for the week. No chance to explain, just humiliation. Plain and simple. I walked home that evening with my uniform still on, every step heavy. People glanced at me on the street and probably thought, "There goes another hotel worker." None of them knew that under my pocket was Rosa's keychain, and in my notebook was a dream that still refused to die. That night I sat on my mattress staring at the ceiling. My savings were pitiful. My rent was due. And now even the job that barely kept me afloat was slipping through my fingers. For the first time in years, I considered giving up. Maybe everyone had been right. Maybe I really was too soft, too naive, too foolish to think I could ever climb higher. But then something strange happened. In that silence, I heard laughter echoing through the vents of memory, guests mocking, supervisors sneering, even that child's voice asking if I was poor. Instead of crushing me, those voices lit a fire. "Fine," I muttered into the darkness. "You want me gone? Watch me come back stronger." I scribbled in my notebook until my pen nearly tore through the paper. Ideas poured out, business concepts, savings plans, even sketches of how my own hotel lobby might look someday. It was messy, desperate, half delirious, but it was mine. The next morning, Rosa found me outside the hotel, still in yesterday's uniform. She raised an eyebrow. "So they threw you under the bus, huh?" I nodded. She handed me a cup of cheap coffee and said, "Good. Now you know how far they'll go to protect themselves. Use it, learn from it, and don't you dare quit." Her words hit me harder than the suspension. I laughed bitterly and said, "Well, if nothing else, I've earned a PhD in being blamed for things I didn't do." Rosa smirked. "Congratulations. That degree will take you far." That week off was painful. My wallet was emptier than the minibar in a budget room. I sold a few old clothes, skipped meals, stretched every coin until it squeaked. But in that struggle I also found clarity. I wasn't meant to be invisible forever. I wasn't meant to be a scapegoat forever. I decided that if the hotel wouldn't give me a future, I'd carve one myself. Even if it meant starting small, even if it meant failing a dozen times first. My suspension eventually ended, and I returned to the hotel as if nothing had happened. But inside, I was different. The humiliation had hardened into resolve. My broom and mop no longer felt like burdens, they were temporary tools. My real work was happening quietly, between shifts, under the cover of exhaustion. Every night after clocking out, I dragged myself back to my tiny room and opened my notebook. I started teaching myself, slowly, stubbornly, business basics, marketing tricks, even the art of negotiation. I scavenged free resources like a crow picking shiny scraps, borrowed library books, old magazines left in the lobby, online articles read on a second-hand phone with a cracked screen. And the best part, I studied while still cleaning. Imagine this. I'd be scrubbing a bathroom sink, earbuds tucked under my hairnet, listening to some lecture about economics. Guests probably thought I was humming to myself, but really I was memorizing terms like asset allocation and compound interest. Historians still argue about whether self-education can rival formal schooling. For me, it wasn't a debate, it was survival. My classroom was a cramped room with peeling paint. My chalkboard was a notebook with coffee stains, and my tuition was time stolen from sleep. Of course, there were hilarious moments in this double life, like the night I was vacuuming the hallway while whispering marketing slogans to myself. A guest walked by and looked at me strangely, probably thinking I was chanting to the vacuum, or when I scribbled down the word liquidity on a scrap of toilet paper, because I'd run out of notebook pages mid-shift. I wasn't just studying finance, I was studying people, watching how guests tipped, how managers delegated, how suppliers delivered. I even started small experiments. For instance, when I set up rooms, I'd add little touches, folding towels in creative shapes, arranging toiletries neatly. Guests noticed, and sometimes they left extra tips. That was proof. Service was an art, and detail created value. Rosa noticed my late nights too. "You're going to burn out," she warned, handing me a sandwich one evening. I smiled and said, "Better to burn out than to stay invisible." She laughed, shaking her head. "You're crazy." But I like crazy. The hardest part wasn't the fatigue, it was the doubt. Some nights I stared at my notes and thought, who are you kidding? You're a janitor with a mop, not a mogul with a plan. But then I remembered those stares, those dismissive voices, and my chest filled with something stronger than doubt, defiance. Slowly, I began putting theory into practice. I saved every extra coin from tips, skipped small luxuries, and opened a bare-bones savings account. The bank teller barely looked at me, but when I signed my name on the form, it felt monumental. A tiny step, yes, but also a declaration. I was building something. I also started taking risks in my education. I volunteered for extra shifts, not just for the money, but to learn how events were managed, how VIP services worked. I shadowed supervisors under the guise of helping out, but really, I was dissecting their every move. And whenever the weight of it all grew too heavy, I cracked a joke to myself. If ambition had calories, I'd be too fat to fit in the elevator by now. Or, forget night school, welcome to Mop University, where the degree is sweat and the tuition is blisters. It was in those nights of hidden study that my dream began to feel less like a fantasy and more like an equation. A long, painful, exhausting equation, but one I was determined to solve, because while others saw me as just a cleaner, I was quietly rewriting my own future, line by line, stain by stain, lesson by lesson. Sometimes destiny doesn't knock politely, it drops a key right in front of your mop bucket. Literally. It was a Tuesday, I think. The hotel was buzzing with a wedding party, guests running in and out with champagne flutes, photographers flashing everywhere. I was stationed on the service stairwell, taking a breather with my broom when I spotted it, a small brass key lying on the floor, glinting under the fluorescent light. At first, I thought it belonged to housekeeping, maybe a storage closet or a lost luggage key. But curiosity tugged at me, and instead of handing it straight to the supervisor, I slipped it into my pocket. Later that night, when the halls were empty, I wandered the quieter floors until I found a forgotten wooden door tucked behind the laundry chute. The key slid into the lock as if it had been waiting for me. With a little twist, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow room filled with old hotel files. The air smelled of dust and mildew like the inside of an antique shop. Boxes were stacked everywhere, ledgers, faded menus, even staff rosters from decades ago. To most, it would have looked like junk. To me, it was a treasure chest. I spent hours in there over the following weeks, flashlight in one hand, notebook in the other. Those ledgers revealed how money flowed through the hotel, where it was wasted, where it multiplied, where one bad decision had cost thousands. I learned that one renovation went over budget by nearly double because no one questioned the supplier's inflated prices. I learned how occupancy dipped during certain seasons, and how rates were adjusted. It was like peeking behind the curtain of a magic trick. The glamorous hotel suddenly looked less like a palace and more like a balancing act of spreadsheets and guesswork. I realized luxury was an illusion built carefully on numbers and perception. Historians still argue about whether luck or strategy drives success stories. That night it felt like both were shaking my hand. Without that lost key, I would have never uncovered the hotel's hidden anatomy. I joked to myself, whispering in the dusty air, "So this is the VIP lounge for nerds, huh? Or, who needs Netflix when you've got 20-year-old invoices to binge?" Those late-night sessions became addictive. I copied numbers into my notebook, compared patterns, even tested ideas in my head. Once, I found an entire box of guest feedback forms. Some were glowing, but many were brutal. Complaints about slow service, rude staff, dusty curtains. I laughed bitterly, knowing I had probably cleaned those very curtains. Yet buried in the complaints was something more valuable, a roadmap. Guests weren't just whining, they were pointing directly at what could be improved. With each discovery, my ambition swelled. I began to imagine my own hotel, not just as a fantasy, but as a blueprint. A place where staff wouldn't be invisible, where service wasn't about hierarchy but genuine care, where details weren't afterthoughts but the main performance. One night, Rosa caught me slipping back from the hidden room. She raised an eyebrow, arms crossed. "You stealing silverware now?" she teased. I showed her the ledger I'd copied instead. She shook her head, laughing. "You're insane, but you're onto something." Then she whispered, "Just don't let management catch you. They don't like dreamers." That warning hung in my chest. But instead of scaring me, it fueled me. Because if studying dusty files in secret was what it took to change my fate, then so be it. And so, with every page of those forgotten ledgers, I wasn't just a cleaner anymore. I was an apprentice to the ghost of the hotel's past, learning, preparing, waiting. By the time most people were slipping into bed, I was clocking into what I called my second shift, not cleaning toilets or scrubbing floors, but plotting a future that didn't yet exist. I'd take my battered notebook, the one with corners curled like old toast, and scribble numbers until my fingers cramped. Rent, food, transport, it all had to be balanced. Yet I still set aside a little pile of money, like a squirrel hoarding acorns for a very long winter. Saving on a cleaner's wage was a joke in itself. I remember staring at my paycheck and thinking, "Ah yes, enough to buy groceries, and maybe half a sock." But I learned tricks. I cut out all the unnecessary things. No morning coffees from the hotel cafe, no shiny shoes, no new clothes unless absolutely essential. I mended old uniforms with thread that didn't even match, just so I wouldn't have to replace them. Sometimes I skipped meals, not because I wanted to, but because I had a dream to feed. And honestly, dreams are hungrier than stomachs. Still, I didn't want to live like a ghost, so I found little ways to earn extra cash. Rosa and I would secretly resell leftover pastries the chefs tossed out to night shift workers down the street once. I even washed cars on weekends, the hotel maid turned part-time car washer, cracking jokes with taxi drivers about whether wax polish counted as luxury service. The harder I worked, the more obsessed I became with what those hidden hotel ledgers had taught me, that money, small or large, was always moving. If I couldn't catch it in buckets, I'd start with teaspoons. Historians still argue whether sacrifice makes a person stronger or just more stubborn. In my case, it was both. Every skipped coffee, every patched-up uniform was a reminder I was building something invisible. One evening, after a particularly long day, Rosa found me hunched over my notebook in the break room. She glanced at my crude sketches of hotel floor plans and said, "You know, normal people doodle flowers." I laughed, pointing at a hand-drawn bar with little stick-figure bartenders. "Well, these are my flowers, and look, mine serve cocktails." The funny thing is, I actually started seeing the world differently. When I scrubbed marble tiles, I thought about maintenance costs. When I changed sheets, I considered supply chains. Even the sound of clinking cutlery during banquets made me think about inventory orders. It was like living in two worlds at once. One where I was invisible in a uniform, and another where I was quietly training to be in charge. But training takes time, and patience wasn't always my best friend. I'd get frustrated watching managers stroll by in tailored suits, sipping espresso while I was dripping sweat. A bitter part of me whispered, 15 years, you'll never make it. Yet another part answered, keep going, they'll see. Sometimes I'd stand in front of the Grand Hotel lobby mirror after my shift, mop still in hand, and imagine myself in a suit instead. The reflection always looked ridiculous, me with a tie drawn onto my throat with eyeliner once, just for laughs. Rosa nearly fainted when she saw me. "You look like a cartoon banker," she said between giggles. But beneath the humor, something serious was growing, a vision so stubborn it refused to die. I wasn't just saving pennies, I was planting them. Each one, I hoped, would grow into something solid. And as the months stretched into years, that little invisible savings fund began to feel heavier in my pocket, like the weight of a secret too powerful to share. There comes a point when saving is no longer enough, when the pile of coins in the jar looks less like treasure and more like potential energy waiting to be set free. That's when I started dipping my toes into the mysterious, sometimes ridiculous, world of investments. I remember my first attempt. It wasn't glamorous. No stocks, no Wall Street drama. Just a second-hand vending machine I bought off a mechanic who swore it only jammed on Tuesdays. I dragged that clunky beast into a rundown office building, filled it with cheap snacks, and prayed it would at least cover its own electricity bill. It did more than that. Turns out, tired office workers will pay triple for stale chips if they daren't have to leave the building. That little vending machine was my first soldier. Then came another. Soon I had a small squad of them, quietly munching coins and spitting out candy bars. While my co-workers were gossiping in the laundry room, I was sneaking glances at profit sheets. Of course, not everything went smoothly. One machine got stolen, another kept eating people's money and turning me into the most hated figure in the building. I had furious calls at midnight. "Hey, your machine just ate my last dollar." I'd apologize, promise a refund, then laugh quietly because honestly, I wasn't a corporate villain. Just a maid with a screwdriver and a dream. Historians still argue whether true entrepreneurs are born or forged in chaos. I'd argue both. You need the stubbornness to keep going when your business empire consists of 3 cranky vending machines and a notebook filled with doodles. The real breakthrough came when I invested in a tiny guest house run by a distant cousin. He was drowning in debt, and I foolishly or bravely put in most of my savings to help him. At first, I thought I'd made the dumbest decision of my life. Guests complained about leaky pipes, peeling wallpaper, and sheets that smelled like wet socks. But with my hotel background, I knew exactly what to fix. I rolled up my sleeves and worked alongside the staff, scrubbing bathrooms by day, balancing ledgers by night. Slowly the guest house transformed, reviews improved, bookings grew. The first time I saw money flow back with interest, I nearly cried. It wasn't just about profit, it was proof that all those sacrifices had meaning. That moment felt like stepping from the shadows into a dim light, still faint but undeniably there. Rosa teased me endlessly. So you've gone from scrubbing their floors to owning their bedsheets, huh? I laughed, but inside I was terrified, because money magnifies mistakes, and one wrong move could sink everything I had built. And yet, there was a thrill to the thrill of watching something I touched turn into more than it was. The thrill of imagining, just for a second, that maybe, one day, I could own something larger, something like the hotel where I had once been invisible. At night, I'd still walk past that lobby mirror, only now the reflection looked slightly less ridiculous. No tie drawn in eyeliner this time, just me, tired but determined, whispering to myself, not yet, but soon. There's a funny thing about success, it doesn't come announced with trumpets or fireworks. It creeps in quietly, almost suspiciously, like a cat that decides to nap on your porch and suddenly never leaves. My small investments, those vending machines and that struggling guest house, had begun to generate steady returns. The coins jingled into notes, and the notes stacked into something more solid. I still lived frugally, still patched my shoes instead of buying new ones, but there was a shift. For the first time, money wasn't just survival, it was leverage. That's when I started dreaming bigger. If I could manage a guest house, why not a hotel? The thought terrified me. It was like staring at a mountain while standing barefoot in a puddle. Still, the idea refused to leave. An opportunity came almost like fate. One of the mid-tier hotels in town, a place I had once cleaned bathrooms in, was sinking fast. Bad management, poor upkeep, and staff morale at rock bottom. Rumors swirled that it would be sold for a fraction of its worth. I remember sitting in a tiny cafe, sipping lukewarm coffee, staring at the for sale notice on my phone. My hands trembled. This was madness. How could a former maid even dream of buying a hotel? But then Rosa's words echoed in my head. The only difference between a boss and a worker is who signs the paycheck. And I thought, why not me? Of course, money was the problem. I didn't have enough to buy a hotel outright, but by then, I'd built a reputation among small investors and lenders as someone reliable. Someone who turned rusty projects into polished gems. With shaking hands and an overworked printer, I crafted a proposal, complete with charts I barely understood but made look convincing. Convincing, apparently, was enough. A handful of backers agreed to join me. They weren't doing it out of charity, they saw profit, and I, trembling but stubborn, signed papers that officially made me part owner of a hotel. Walking into that building for the first time as an owner was surreal. The wallpaper was peeling, the carpet smelled vaguely of wet dog, and the reception desk wobbled if you leaned on it too hard. But I saw potential. More than that, I saw memory. I remembered scrubbing those very tiles, wiping down those very mirrors, ignored by guests who never saw me. Now, the same guests would walk past and see me in a different way, whether they liked it or not. The staff eyed me skeptically at first. Some recognized me, one even whispered, "Isn't she the maid who used to—" I smiled politely and moved on. I didn't need to explain myself. I would let the results do that. The first weeks were brutal. Plumbing disasters, irate guests, a booking system so outdated it looked like it belonged in a museum. I slept in one of the empty guest rooms most nights, waking up at dawn to tackle whatever crisis had popped up. My body remembered the rhythms of cleaning, but now I had to balance that with leadership, budgeting, marketing, even negotiating with suppliers. And oh, the suppliers. They tried to overcharge me, thinking I was naive. They didn't expect me to remember exactly how much toilet paper a hotel of this size actually used in a month. Let's just say, I won that battle, and they didn't try it again. Historians still argue whether grit or luck plays the larger role in success stories. Standing there in that crumbling hotel, armed with grit and very little luck, I decided I'd rely on the one thing I'd never run out of: stubbornness. Slowly, things improved. Fresh paint, new linens, a small but efficient breakfast buffet. Guests began leaving kinder reviews. A travel blogger accidentally stumbled in one weekend, wrote a glowing article, and suddenly bookings ticked upward. It wasn't glamorous, yet it was survival. But it was survival with momentum. And each day, as I walked through that lobby, I felt the ghost of my past self trailing behind me, mop in hand, watching silently. This time, though she smiled, the first year as a hotel owner felt like walking a tightrope strung above a pit of alligators. One misstep, one bad review, one missed bill and I'd tumble straight down. Yet, every day that I didn't fall gave me a little more balance, a little more confidence. I still wore simple clothes, still did small tasks myself, partly out of habit and partly because I didn't trust anyone else to get them right. There were mornings when guests would mistake me for a cleaner again. Instead of correcting them, I'd grab a cloth and actually clean a spot they pointed out. Then, when they checked out, their receipt would carry my signature at the bottom. I can't lie, that part felt delicious. Of course, owning a hotel wasn't just about scrubbing floors anymore. I had to learn the language of hospitality, the way to turn problems into opportunities. Like when the air conditioner broke during a heat wave, I handed out complimentary ice cream cones from a local shop. Guests thought it was a quirky touch. I thought it was a miracle they didn't riot. But the most surreal moment came one evening when a group of tourists arrived late. Their faces were familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. Then I realized they were the very family I had served years ago, the ones who'd treated me like I was invisible while they lounged in their robes. I still remembered carrying their suitcases up 3 flights of stairs, smiling while they complained about how cheap the service felt. Now they were checking into my hotel. At first they didn't recognize me. Why would they? Back then I was part of the furniture, like the lamp in the corner, useful but unnoticed. This time I stood at the reception desk, professionally dressed, hair neatly tied back, welcoming them with the same calm smile. When I handed them their keycards, I caught the flicker of recognition in the mother's eyes. She squinted, leaned in, and whispered something to her husband. He shrugged, dismissive, but the son, the one who once tossed his towel on the floor for me to pick up, stared a little longer. Then, with a half smirk, he said, "Haven't we seen you before?" I tilted my head slightly, as though recalling a vague memory. "Perhaps," I said smoothly. "I've worked in hospitality for a long time." It was true, just not in the way they imagined. The next few days, I caught them whispering now and then, probably debating whether I was the same maid they once brushed past. If they figured it out, they never said anything outright. Maybe pride stopped them, maybe they thought they were imagining it. Either way, I didn't press it. Some ghosts are best left to haunt quietly. Instead, I focused on running the hotel better than ever. I started introducing small touches. Local pastries in the breakfast spread. Handwritten notes welcoming guests. Even tiny lavender sachets in the pillows. People loved those details. They wrote about them in reviews. Suddenly, my modest hotel wasn't just decent for the price. It was a charming hidden gem. Of course, there were moments of absurdity too, like the time the fire alarm went off because a guest tried to cook noodles with a travel iron, or when an entire wedding party demanded refunds because the bride's dress didn't fit and they decided it was somehow the hotel's fault. Running a hotel meant collecting stories as bizarre as they were frustrating. Historians still argue whether history repeats itself or just rhymes. For me, it felt like I was rewriting my own rhyme. Once I'd been the girl cleaning up after careless guests. Now I was the woman steering an entire establishment, deciding who stayed and how they were treated. That family checked out after 3 days, leaving behind a generous but oddly awkward tip. Perhaps guilt makes wallets a little looser. I didn't touch the money myself. I passed it on to the cleaning staff. The look on their faces reminded me of how much small kindness once meant to me, and that, I realized, was my quiet revenge. Not humiliating those who looked down on me, but proving to myself and to them, if they noticed that I'd climbed out of the corner where they once shoved me. The hotel wasn't just surviving anymore, it was thriving, and deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Expansion crept into my life like an unexpected guest who overstays their welcome, except in this case, I didn't want them to leave. My hotel was consistently booked. reviews piled up online with little stars glowing like constellations, and travel blogs began whispering about the surprising charm of this hidden gem. I pretended to be casual about it, but inside I was squealing like someone who just found out their crush liked them back. The profits rolled in, and with them came decisions bigger than I'd ever imagined making. Do I open another hotel? Do I renovate this one into something grander? Do I finally upgrade my phone that still freezes whenever I open 2 apps at once? The third option sounded the most tempting at times. One late evening, after guests had retired and the corridors grew quiet except for the occasional creak of settling wood, I stood in the lobby staring at the chandelier. Not a grand chandelier. Mind you, this one was modest, probably older than me, and it flickered as if it had secrets to tell. I caught myself daydreaming about bigger lobbies, taller ceilings, maybe even marble floors. That's when it hit me. I didn't just want to run one hotel, I wanted to build a small empire. But ambition comes with its own quirks. The very next morning, a plumbing disaster reminded me that empires are built on pipes that sometimes burst at inconvenient moments. There I was, ankle deep in water, holding a wrench like it was Excalibur, trying to remember if righty-tighty lefty-loosey applied when water was spraying in my face. Spoiler, it did, eventually. I hired more staff, and that felt like giving away pieces of myself. I had to learn to trust others with things I used to guard like secrets. Delegating was harder than scrubbing 20 bathrooms in a row, but slowly I got better at it. My staff became my team, and my team became a strange, dysfunctional family. There was Marta, who folded towels with such precision that I swear you could measure angles with them. There was Samir, who had a knack for remembering every guest's breakfast order before they even spoke. And there was Lily, a student working part-time, who had the uncanny ability to find lost items, phones, keys, even dignity. The first time I handed over full control of the front desk to Marta while I took a day off, I paced my apartment like an expectant parent. Would things crumble without me? Would she accidentally book the same room twice? But when I returned, everything was running smoother than ever. It was humbling, and a little annoying, to realize I wasn't indispensable. Then came the investors. They smelled success like sharks smelled blood in the water, or maybe like dogs smelled barbecue from 3 blocks away. They offered to buy shares, expand chains, merge brands. My instinct was to laugh them out of the room, but instead, I listened carefully. Some offers were ridiculous, others tempting. Still, I remembered that this hotel was built on my sweat, my quiet stubbornness, and my ability to keep going even when others saw me as nothing. Selling it too soon would have felt like selling a piece of my soul. Of course, the universe has its sense of humor. Just when everything seemed to be reaching new heights, a small incident reminded me of my roots. One afternoon, as I was showing a new guest their suite, they asked casually, "Do you ever miss working in hotels before you owned one?" I chuckled and answered, "Sometimes. It was simpler then. I just followed instructions. Now, I give them." But that night, alone in my office, I thought about it. Did I miss it? The answer was complicated. I didn't miss being invisible, or being spoken to like I was less than human. But I did miss the clarity of it, the comfort of routine. The way the hardest part of the day was folding sheets without creasing them wrong. Life as an owner was bigger, better, but also messier. Historians still argue whether ambition is humanity's greatest gift or its worst curse. For me, it was both. It lifted me out of servitude but kept me awake at night counting risks instead of sheep. Yet, even with the sleepless nights, even with the stress, I couldn't stop smiling when I thought about how far I had come. I once belonged to the background, my name forgotten as quickly as a room service tray left in the hall. Now, I was front and center, and for the first time in my life, the spotlight didn't feel like it would burn me. And maybe, just maybe, that meant it was time to dream even bigger. Dreaming bigger is dangerous. It tempts you into maps you've never charted, territories filled with possibilities, but also with pitfalls sharp enough to shred everything you've built. Yet, I couldn't help myself. My hotel was thriving, my vending machine days far behind me, and still, there was a whisper inside me that said, "This isn't the end. Keep going." So I began scouting. not with the wide-eyed innocence of someone stumbling into opportunity, but with the steady calculation of someone who's already been burned by life and knows where the flames hide. I walked into shabby inns with peeling paint and saw not decay, but potential. I visited seaside towns where the salt air had corroded every door hinge and thought, guests will pay double for this view if the sheets don't smell like fish. The second property I bought was a disaster. Literally, it had mold growing in corners, plumbing that sang like an opera whenever you flushed, and a staircase that looked one stomp away from ending someone's life. My friends thought I'd lost my mind. Why sink money into that rotting skeleton, they asked. But I knew. I had lived in shadows long enough to recognize hidden light. I poured every ounce of energy into reviving that place. I hired architects who thought I was insane, builders who muttered under their breath, and designers who tried to convince me marble bathtubs were essential. Spoiler, they weren't. What was essential was cleanliness, warmth, and the feeling that someone had thought carefully about the guests' comfort. That was my secret weapon because I knew what it felt like to be invisible, and I swore no guest would ever feel that way in my hotels. It took a year, countless sleepless nights, and more money than I dared calculate. But when we reopened the doors, the building no longer whispered of decay, it sang of welcome. Guests poured in. Photos of the transformation spread online, shared with captions like, "From haunted house to heaven." My inbox filled with inquiries from other struggling owners, asking if I'd consider rescuing their properties too. That's when I realized something important. I wasn't just running hotels anymore. I was creating a brand. The word brand had always sounded foreign to me, like something glossy corporations tossed around at board meetings. But now, it was personal. My name, my story, my journey, it all became part of what guests felt when they walked through the doors. People weren't just booking rooms, they were booking a piece of my resilience, my stubbornness, my refusal to quit. But success carries echoes. One evening, as I was inspecting the lobby of my second hotel, I saw a family walk in, tired, carrying heavy bags, clearly not wealthy. Their clothes were plain, their shoes worn. They looked around with awe, almost as if they didn't belong there, and I caught my breath, because once, not long ago, I had looked exactly like them, worn out, uncertain, afraid of not belonging. I welcomed them personally, carried their luggage even though I had staff for that, and offered them tea. They relaxed, their shoulders lowering, and when their child smiled at me, it felt like a full circle moment. I wasn't just serving guests anymore. I was serving people who reminded me of myself. Historians still debate whether success changes a person or simply reveals who they were all along. Standing in that lobby, I knew my answer. Success hadn't erased the girl who once scrubbed floors for a living. It had only given her a louder voice. And with that voice came a responsibility I hadn't anticipated, to prove that dignity isn't tied to money. That kindness isn't reserved for those who can afford it. And that sometimes the best hospitality comes not from luxury, but from remembering what it feels like to be invisible. My hotels would grow, my empire would expand. But I promised myself one thing. I would never forget the sound of my own footsteps echoing down those long, anonymous hotel corridors when I was nothing more than a shadow among the living. Because that shadow, in the end, was what taught me to seek the light. The empire didn't arrive with trumpets or confetti. It crept in quietly, almost shyly, as if afraid I'd notice it too soon and scare it away. One day, I was signing contracts for laundry services and taste-testing soap samples because yes, apparently guests care deeply if their shampoo smells like forest mist or calm ocean breeze. The next I was sitting in a boardroom with lawyers, accountants, and advisors, realizing that somehow, impossibly, I owned not one, not two, but a small constellation of hotels. It was surreal. I still woke up some mornings half convinced I'd overslept and would be late for my cleaning shift, only to open my eyes to a view of the skyline from a penthouse suite. Talk about a plot twist. But then came the moment, the one I had secretly daydreamed about on my hardest nights. It wasn't fame, or a big paycheck, or even the ribbon-cutting ceremonies. It was the day I walked into that hotel, the one where I had once been a ghost in a maid's uniform and, saw my name etched into polished brass above the lobby doors. Guests were bustling inside, wheeling suitcases, snapping selfies, and sipping overpriced lattes. They had no idea of the history soaked into those walls. They didn't know about the girl who scrubbed their sinks until her hands cracked, or who was once too embarrassed to meet their eyes when they asked for fresh towels. But I knew, and that was enough. I ran my fingers along the railing of the staircase. I climbed thousands of times in silence. Now those same steps led to rooms filled with warmth, light, and care. No more flickering bulbs, no more forgotten corners. I had rewritten the story of that building and, in doing so, rewritten my own. Of course, irony has a sense of humor sharper than any comedian, because not long after, I spotted familiar faces in the crowd. The family who once looked down on me, the ones who had treated me like I was nothing more than background noise. They were dragging matching designer luggage, their sunglasses perched too perfectly. They didn't recognize me at first. Why would they? To them, I was still the invisible girl in the uniform. But then they saw the plaque, they saw my name, and their expressions shifted in that delicious, slow-motion way that you can't script even if you tried. Shock, confusion, then something almost like fear. I didn't gloat. Not out loud, anyway. Instead, I smiled, offered them a room upgrade, and handed them a keycard with my logo embossed in gold. "Enjoy your stay," I said, my voice steady.com, almost gentle. Because true revenge, as the old saying goes, isn't served cold, it's served with hospitality so flawless it leaves no room for bitterness. They slept under my roof. They ate food prepared by my chefs. They lived, however briefly, inside a world I had built brick by stubborn brick. And when they left, I think they finally understood what I had always known. That respect can't be demanded, only earned. Historians still argue whether history is a cycle, repeating endlessly, or a ladder, rising rung by rung. For me, it was both. I had circled back to the same hallways, the same rooms, but on a higher level, one built not of dust and neglect, but of dignity and dreams. And as I locked the lobby doors that night, the city lights glowing like constellations beyond the glass, I whispered to myself, I made it. Not just out of the shadows, but into a place of my own making, and for the first time, I believed it. Now, let the lights dim even further. Imagine the echo of footsteps fading down a carpeted hallway, softer and softer, until they dissolve completely. The story has wound itself into silence, like a candle burning down to the very last glow of its wick. You might picture the lobby, empty now, chairs neatly tucked in, a faint scent of polished wood lingering in the air. Outside, the city hums, but it feels distant, muffled, almost like a lullaby. The buildings rise like quiet guardians, their windows blinking gently against the night. And inside, where once there was struggle, there is peace. The walls hold not just memories of labor and loneliness, but also resilience, laughter, and soft rest. It's a place no longer heavy with invisibility, but light with presence. As you drift, let yourself imagine you're checking into that hotel not for work, not for duty, but simply to rest. A keycard in your hand, a room waiting just for you. The bed is made, sheets cool and smooth, the kind of space where even the most restless thoughts soften. Breathe slowly, like the rhythm of an elevator gliding up without a sound. Let each inhale feel like stepping through a quiet hallway, and each exhale like opening a door into a sanctuary prepared only for you. And if your mind still lingers on the story, let it fade like distant chatter in the lobby, far away, unimportant. What matters now is this moment, this gentle hush. You've arrived at the final stop for tonight's journey, so close your eyes. Let the dream take over, and rest deeply.